Hi everyone, this is Freddie with Superbike Unlimited, and we're going to bring you another update on the 2021 ZX-10RR Superbike project. And what we're doing right now is we're beginning to take everything apart, but before we completely do our disassembly, we are going to do another dyno test with RPM data so we can give you torque. And also just because we had a handful of people who seem to be highly triggered by the results that we got in the last test, and most people understand that these things stock, they're just not going to perform really well, and unfortunately it's not realistic to expect a modern stock Japanese motorcycle to make like 180 horsepower on the dyno because they're really restricted. It's, you know, it's nothing against this bike, it's just in order to comply with laws, especially in the US, they just tend to be quite choked up, and that's just to be expected. There's very few. Some of the European stuff's not so bad, but typically everything that comes out of Japan is going to be that way. So we are going to do another series of dyno pulls. We're going to have RPM data to get an accurate torque value, which we wanted anyway for future reference. We're going to do SAE as the correction factor because that's a pretty widely accepted standard here in the US. For most of our project bikes, we actually use DIN or DIN, and the reason for that is because most of the people that we're collaborating with overseas in Europe use that as the standard. So it's just something that we like to use to compare with their numbers and kind of see what our stuff looks like compared to theirs. So right now what Tex is doing is just disassembling this. And one thing I did want to point out is what he was just referring to. Did you want to touch base on that with how much more difficult it is to remove this fairing compared to the previous generation?
Oh, I don't know that it's that much more difficult. It's just like a 17-piece jigsaw puzzle where you got to take this off to get that off. There's bolts that are hidden that you have to pull the fairing away from the bike and reach behind to get to.
It's just more time consuming, not difficult.
It's definitely not designed to come off in a hurry.
Okay, yeah, so it's just something that he noticed, that this new fairing looks really sleek, but it's just a bit more time consuming to get to everything, and to remove the upper fairing. Essentially all of the lower fairing appears to have to come off to do that without, you know, torquing on stuff and pulling on stuff improperly. So we'll be the next shot we'll have is back on the dyno, and we'll see what this thing does in terms of torque. Again, don't expect much. It's going to be really choked up, so this is just for a reference, and it'll just be cool to see how much we gain after we start doing all the work. So more on that in a bit. Okay, so as we're progressing along this, we're finding some stuff that's kind of alarming. One thing that Tex discovered right away when he lifted the fuel tank up, there was actually a rag under there, and Tex has been an OEM mechanic for a long time at Japanese and European dealerships. So I asked him, does that something where they would lift the fuel tank at the dealership doing, you know, prep out of the crate? And he goes, no. So essentially somebody from Japan presumably left a rag under the fuel tank. Now what he's called me in to look at is when we've got the airbox off, there's a boot that's been crushed in between the throttle bodies and the airbox. We're going to have to make sure, for one, that that's even usable anymore, but for sure this could have a pretty big impact on our engine performance and the way our bike runs. So this could be one of the reasons our bike didn't dyno very high. So we're going to see if we can fix that first, and if not, then we're going to have to order that part and wait before we do our second dyno test. But that's could be one of the factors in why our results weren't so great. So we'll find out here shortly. So another thing you may have noticed in here that's really important with this issue, something that some of you may have heard, is that the airbox design is completely different on that, and it is. And what we're seeing, these are our velocity stacks, so we don't have the same type of inlet funnels that we did on the previous generation that were actuated, and you know, obviously there was a lot more going on than what you have here. So for one, that means that we can't use the funnels that we used on our previous motorcycle. And also, this is just a completely new design. It's going to be interesting to see how this might impact mid-range power. Presumably it's going to be pretty good up top, but we have to wonder if this might compromise a little bit of our mid. So we'll find out about that as well. Okay, so we've got our RR warming up on the dyno right now, and we'll be doing some pulls in a moment. So we'll be able to provide that torque value and give you guys the detailed data that we weren't able to do in that first video for the sake of speed. Regarding the airbox issue, so that boot is molded into the airbox, or well, it's actually glued on, but it's a permanent bond kind of thing. So we don't have access to another airbox. However, what we did do is we removed it, we let it sit, and we used the heat gun and applied a very small amount of heat at a distance, and it seems to have taken back its original shape. So we're just going to run it the way it is for now. We are going to see about getting another one under warranty. because it was like that right out of the box. And we'll see, if it becomes an issue or not. If nothing else, we'll have a spare. But what we're gonna do now is finish warming this thing up, and then we'll give you some more pulls, and we'll see A, if our boot issue had any impact on the horsepower, and B, what kind of torque this thing's making in stock trim. Okay, so that's going to be a wrap for the stock dyno pulls. What we have done is obviously gotten our RPM data that was so hotly contested, and we've done several pulls now. I went ahead and warmed the bike up and just did pull after pull just to try to get the best possible comparison and compare the best two runs from pre-RPM to post-RPM. And spoiler alert, there is no difference in horsepower because, as we know, RPM is not used to calculate horsepower. There was some back and forth in the comment sections on the original video that it wasn't hooked up right, and that's why it read so low. That's just not how it works. Unfortunately, for torque, you must have RPM, but for horsepower, that's not how it's calculated. So what we're going to do is show you here. For one, we have SAE is the correction factor. That was a concern for some folks, and so we have moved that over. And what you can see is run file 5 was our best run previously, and we had 164.96, and at speed 122 miles an hour, 0.59. And now what we're seeing is 164.91 at speed 122.9 miles per hour. Of course, now we have torque, which is 74.83, and it has a speed value. In just a moment, we're gonna move that over to RPM so you can see some clear explanation of where we're making power and where our drop-off is occurring. But just so you can see, that there's no, that we're being completely transparent here. There's a lot of runs on here, and they're pretty consistent in those numbers. Sorry about that, the battery died on this thing again. But you'll see that on some of the earlier runs that the numbers do go down, and that's just because as the thing's warming up, it takes time basically for the oil temp to come up, and we start seeing those really consistent values. So we did the same thing when we did our first pulls. As you can see, the highest one was number 5. Anyway, so we're gonna go back to our best, which was run file 17, and here we go. And here we're going to switch to RPM so we can have a clearer picture of what these restrictions are actually doing. So you can see that right around here, this is going to be where our drive-by-wire restrictions begin, and that's where the power just falls off, when really this thing should be pulling pretty close to red line. And we have drive-by-wire cutting power at about 11.5. Doesn't have a really of an impact on torque, which is actually peaking out right around there, because torque is typically not made at the same RPM, high RPM, that we see horsepower being made at. So that's why we're not seeing a huge impact. Realistically, once we tune this thing up and put a pipe on it and stuff, we would expect this to be closer to 80, and hopefully this in the 190s, high 190s ideally. But we'll just have to see, and that's on pump gas. So I think that's going to do it. Hopefully this has been clear enough. It's something that, as I mentioned before, some dynos do simply read higher. This is because it doesn't get any more clear cut than this is a stock bike that was broken in a way that we found to produce very good horsepower, and it's the same protocol that factory teams go by. Been doing it for years and years here. We do it for all of our Superbike engine builds and so on and so forth. So all those variables are eliminated. This thing is making as much as it can in stock trim. It's just, so we do this to show people that, hey, you may think that your bike makes 220 horsepower with a slip-on and a flash and that kind of thing. Realistically, it probably doesn't, and it certainly wouldn't make that here. But that's not a slight against those people, those bikes, or those shops, because those shops are not realistically doing anything to manipulate those values. It's just that some dynos read a lot different, and some of the stuff that we're seeing, some of the dynos that we have people making comments about, it's making X amount of horsepower, substantially more than this. They are older dynos, we can see, and they're not using the current generation of hardware and software to actually do the calculation and interpolation that we're seeing. So we have DynoWare RT, which is DynoJet's latest and greatest, and a lot of those have like the old WinPep 7 stuff, which isn't even supported by DynoJet in any way anymore. So it's not the best thing to compare those two things, So again, it's just a tool. What we're looking for with dyno numbers is what we made starting and what we made to finish. Having an older dyno, we used to have one. Actually, we still do have one here. It's actually sitting over here because we're going to sell it to somebody. But you can still do a calibration perfectly fine on something like that. We just like to have newer stuff when it comes, especially on the hardware and software side, with how it's calculating and reading the values off of our actual drum. So anyway, that's going to do it for the stock dyno wing. Next, we're going to begin the full teardown and build of this bike. We've got a lot of big updates coming, so be sure to watch. Thanks again for watching.